Hello and welcome to this video proving the axiom, dose makes the poison. This is often used in pharmacology to explain how some things can be dangerous in high doses but harmless in low doses. Somewhere in between these two extremes is the medical application, a similar conundrum to the Goldilocks syndrome of needing something to be just right. The problem of how much, when, and what often becomes apparent when dosing medications. Too much, too soon, and you can box someone's kidneys when administering antibiotics. Too little, and the bacteria will proliferate, and the antibiotics can even cause resistance. The opposite is true of analgesia. Too little pain relief, and it will leave patients to suffer. Too much pain relief, and you will cause an overdose, and permanently resolve their pain issues. Just the right amount to take away pain, but not so much as to cause harm, nor so frequently as to cause an overdose. Practically, sugar and other energy sources are a perfect example. Too much over too long and too frequently, obesity occurs, and possibly much later diabetes. Too little and starvation occurs. Just right and you lose a little weight, as with dieting. Just a little more than enough and you gain weight, as with bulking. Just right and you remain the same weight. This concept is best demonstrated with two examples that require far less thought at first: hyperhydration and oxygen toxicity. Yes, both water and oxygen are dangerous at certain doses, yet breathing is something most people do without ever thinking about it. Water for many is a given thing, something they can turn a tap and out will come water. Rather than explain how dehydration or suffocation kill, given we assume that you are at least that competent, we will instead look at the other end of the scenario. Or what if there is too much water or too much oxygen in your body? Water is generally accepted to be consumed at a rate of about 2 liters a day. Much of this is in the food we consume. Approximately a quarter of this value is in water alone. That is something you'd be drinking out of a glass, in the form of a soft drink, or mixed with cordial and so on. However you consume it, it's straight water. The problem is simply put as too much water consumed in a very short time. That is hyperhydration. Mostly it's a case of natural selection taking effect during water drinking contests. In other cases, physical exercise causes a loss of a large amount of water from the body, and then commensurate attempts to compensate for that fluid loss by intake of new fluids. The problem with this is the loss of body fluids will often have unintended consequences, largely the loss of electrolytes and other solutes. When you consume extra water in an attempt to compensate for what you lost during physical activity, or by drinking too much in a short period of time, your body then tries to get rid of this excess water in urine. This extra urine production leads to loss of even more solutes. An important example of this would be sodium, which is essential for the body's function. The lack of solutes, like sodium and other electrolytes, causes the fluid that would normally sit outside your cells and inside your cells to get out of balance. By shifting the different concentrations of the electrolytes and other solutes in fluid, you cause water both inside and outside the cell to move. This movement is a big problem. It's also a very basic biological process called osmosis. When you have too much fluid inside of something with a semi-permeable membrane and a lot of solutes outside of it, water will move from inside that semi-permeable membrane out of it. This leads to a sort of dehydration or desiccation of it. This is especially true of a cell, and it's one of the reasons why you will have a headache from a hangover if you have spent a heavy night drinking. The opposite is of course also true. If you have a lot of fluid outside of a semi-permeable membrane and a lot of solutes within it, water will move into and through that semi-permeable membrane, causing the inside to swell, and if after a certain point it exceeds the capacity to hold that water, it will break in a process called lysis. This latter example is what we begin to see if you consume too much water. The water that is in your body attempts to draw out all of the possible solutes it can, and this goes into urine and leaves your body. What it is kept is inside your cells, and this means water will now move through that semi-permeable membrane of a cell, enter it, and begin to build up inside of cells. From this, they begin to swell. Swelling is your first sign that something is very wrong. It creates symptoms like headaches, personality changes, confusion, drowsiness, all your standard signs of dehydration, but you've just become extremely hydrated. From here, the next issues begin to develop as it affects your nervous system, changes in breathing, the difficulty with moving muscles, pain, cramps, vomiting. All of these are a result of interfering with not only your central nervous system, but the signals from your body to your brain. There are big issues with the way your body tries to then communicate, as the nerves themselves begin to become damaged or malfunction. Some important solutes, such as those involved in contraction of muscles, can leave the body, and this is an especially problematic development when we talk about the heart. If both the nerves in the heart and the muscles in the heart are both experiencing dysfunction, your heart can no longer beat, and you can no longer get the necessary pulses of nervous activity to have it beat. This means both the rate of a heartbeat and the ability of the heart to contract itself becomes irregular. Parts of the brain, such as the brainstem, may have cells either become swollen or destroyed in their entirety, which would then affect your most animalistic of impulses, like breathing. It is possible that, given enough time, either through the administration of IV fluids that are balanced, the body slowly recovering through taking things like calcium out of the bones, removing various salts from food that have been consumed, and so on, you will recover. But in the short term, hyperhydration can lead to damage, and not just short-term damage, but long-term damage from cells that have been damaged and are irreplaceable. In contrast to these sorts of actions and events that can occur either through gross stupidity or not being aware of the necessary precautions involved in extreme physical activity, there is oxygen. Oxygen is, of course, a gas we breathe in. We breathe in oxygen in an effort to expel CO2, and so intake of excess oxygen does not drive a change in breathing. Our body entirely has its breathing regulated by how much CO2 is in our body and the change it has on the pH of our blood. It is fundamentally, completely out of the human conscious control. You will find that even holding your breath does not prevent you from breathing, it simply blocks the necessary channels for air to move into your lungs. Normally, we breathe in about 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. This enters the bloodstream from our lungs where it is used. The metabolic processes in the body then return about half of this as CO2. The partial pressure of oxygen in blood and the lungs nearly always reaches an equilibrium under normal atmospheric conditions. This can change in locations such as a hyperbaric chamber or so-called oxygen bars. In those situations, the 100 millimeters of mercury of oxygen is not able to be maintained. Atmospheric levels of oxygen reach pressures well beyond normal levels of 1 atmosphere if you get deep down into the ocean, and much less than 1 atmosphere if you go extremely high into the hills and mountains. Under abnormal conditions, such as a hyperbaric chamber or an oxygen bar, it can be as high as 3 times normal, or 3 atmospheres. This will of course mean that when you breathe in the oxygen, you have much more than 100 millimeters of mercury of pressure trying to push oxygen into your body. This is where we go from not just the relatively short-term issues, but longer-term problems with exposure to differences in oxygen levels. If you have relatively normal oxygen levels, you should be fine. There is of course a gradient to how much oxygen is out there, and if you're going to breathe in pure 100% oxygen, it can be maintained at normal atmospheric pressure for 24 to 48 hours. This won't cause any lasting tissue damage. Beyond this time frame, you begin to find that tissue injury will occur. If we talk about 100% oxygen, but we go above normal atmospheric pressure, you can find that it begins to cause issues, particularly in the lungs. It can cause inflammation and damage in as little as 3 to 6 hours. Coughing and sustained coughing can be achieved after 10 hours. One of the problems with excess oxygen is that it's not necessarily carried by hemoglobin, but instead can become dissolved in blood. This creates a new problem. It leads to new oxygen species called reactive oxygen species. These, as the name would suggest, are not friendly chemicals, but chemicals that can disrupt. One of the examples of this is lipid peroxidation. This is where lipids in the cell membrane become reactive to the oxygen, and so you get changes that occur. These changes then cause the membranes to become disrupted and you damage the cell. Other possible sites of interaction include nucleic acids in DNA, protein and protein synthesis, cellular enzymes, and some necessary cofactors. If you have continued exposure to high levels of oxygen, this will just continue to grow as the number of free radicals or free reactive oxygen species will increase. In the lungs, there are notable sites where you need to be concerned. This includes the epithelium, or the inside lining of the lungs that is used to separate the blood from the air. There's also surfactants in there, and surfactants are what ensure that each of the tiny little pockets in the lung stay open. Once this becomes damaged or inactivated, those small pockets begin to collapse and they cannot be reopened. You then also have areas where the alveolar, which are those small pockets, join together, and these can become damaged. In extreme cases, you can find that the parts of the lung which are meant to expand when you're breathing begin to thicken and undergo fibrosis. That means the lungs can no longer expand properly and it will reduce your pulmonary capacity. These phenomena do not go without notice in the body though. The body begins at first to try and deal with this in a similar manner to sunburn, edema. Edema is where it then tries to compensate by putting fluid out, and that fluid normally carries with it a variety of immune cells and extra material to try and repair and replace what has been damaged. In some cases, the parts of the lung that have been damaged can also begin bleeding, as it is a very thin wall between the area in the lung that holds gas and the area in the lung that holds the blood. Once the very thin, single epithelial cell thick wall gets damaged, blood can find its way through. Once that damage begins to occur, inflammation will also follow, primarily the expression of cytokines to rally both immune cells and other functions to try and help the lungs to become repaired and return to as close to normal function as possible. Assuming that somehow the amount of oxygen in your lungs has been maintained for long enough that not only is damage apparent in your lungs, but it'll begin showing up elsewhere. You can begin damaging just about anywhere in your body. But sadly, one of the first locations after your lungs will be your brain and spinal cord. Your central nervous system has a very high dependency on oxygen for nerves to be able to function. If you experience oxygen toxicity, you can begin exhibiting convulsions and amnesia very early on. Damage to the eyes is another common event. Thankfully, the myopia that this causes can be reversible. Delayed cataract formation. There's also fibroplasia of the retinal lentil area. You can see how small amounts of damage, and especially small amounts of excess oxygen, can lead to something pretty bad over the very long term. Just what we've mentioned with the eyes and lungs alone, plus possible complications with the cardiovascular system, all occur not immediately, but over a much longer time frame when you're exposed to unusually high amounts of oxygen and or high amounts of oxygen at a higher than atmospheric pressure, which leads to a difference in how the body has to handle it internally. That doesn't even begin to account for all of the secondary effects that are going to occur downstream from having an increased amount of oxygen in your body. For example, a significant increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that is generated in response to the increased metabolism as a result of having more oxygen, and a decrease in the possible ventilation that can occur because you have a competition between the increased amount of oxygen and the available amount of CO2 that's trying to get out and be replaced. As should be evident, two common and seemingly innocuous chemicals, something that we take for granted every day, can cause extreme and unexpected toxicity. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.